The silence that followed was deafening. In a building full of people who thought they controlled everything, the most powerful voice in basketball simply walked away. Caitlyn Clark had just delivered the most devastating blow to Team USA basketball in the organization's history, and she didn't even need words to do it. The training camp roster was announced, and her name wasn't on it. Not because she couldn't play, not because she wasn't good enough, because she refused to abandon the very identity that had made her unstoppable. But this isn't just another sports story about a player missing a training camp. This is the moment when athlete empowerment reached a breaking point, when someone finally said no to institutional disrespect, when the most powerful player in women's basketball decided that her dignity was worth more than any jersey they could offer. The crisis began 3 days earlier, when Team USA basketball made a decision so tone-deaf, so completely out of touch with reality, that it would ultimately cost them their biggest star. They told Caitlyn Clark that her iconic number 22, the number that had become synonymous with revolution in women's sports, would not be permitted for their December training camp. Think about that for a moment. They wanted to strip away the most recognizable symbol in women's basketball, the number that hangs in bedrooms across America, the digits that represent hope for countless young players who see themselves in Clark's journey. They wanted her to abandon the very thing that had made her untouchable. And her response? Absolutely not. But here's where this story takes an even more explosive turn. Sue Bird, the managing director who had handpicked Clark for this camp, is reportedly losing her mind behind the scenes as she watches her organization destroy its own credibility. She's trapped between loyalty to USA basketball and recognition of basketball reality. They just picked a fight with the one person who has single-handedly brought millions of new fans to their sport. This isn't about a jersey number. This is about institutional arrogance meeting modern player empowerment in the most spectacular fashion possible. This is about watching the old guard try to control someone who has already transcended their ability to contain her. And what happens next will determine whether we just witness the death of institutional respect for individual achievement, or the birth of a new era where athletes finally understand their true worth. The world just changed, and most people don't even realize it yet. But before we dive deeper into this explosive standoff, we need to understand something crucial. This isn't happening in a vacuum. What we're witnessing right now is the culmination of a pattern of disrespect that goes back months, maybe even years, and it reveals everything wrong with how the basketball establishment treats the very people who make their sport worth watching. Let's rewind to earlier this year, when the Olympic roster was announced. Caitlyn Clark, the player who had just shattered every scoring record in college basketball history, the athlete who had single-handedly brought mainstream attention back to women's sports, was conspicuously absent from that roster. Not injured, not unavailable, just ignored. Left out like she was just another player. The explanation at the time was that the Olympic team needed experienced players, veterans who could handle the pressure of international competition. But anyone with half a brain could see through that smokescreen. Clark had just proven in the WNBA that she could handle any pressure thrown her way. She was filling arenas, breaking television ratings records, and becoming a cultural phenomenon that transcended basketball itself. And yet, when it came time to represent her country on the world's biggest stage, she was deemed not good enough, not talented enough, not worthy enough. That snub sent shockwaves through the entire sports world, but it was just the beginning. Because once you start paying attention, once you start looking for the pattern, it becomes impossible to miss. The subtle exclusions from promotional materials, the way her achievements get minimized in official statements, the constant need to remind everyone that she still has to earn her place among the established stars. It's like watching a masterclass in how to systematically marginalize someone who has fundamentally changed your entire industry. Because make no mistake about it, Caitlyn Clark didn't just join women's basketball, she saved it. She brought in millions of new fans who had never watched a second of women's sports before. She made the WNBA relevant again. She turned basketball games into cultural events that people talked about for weeks afterward. But instead of celebrating that revolutionary impact, instead of recognizing her as the generational talent she clearly is, the old guard keeps trying to put her in her place. They keep trying to remind her that no matter how big she gets, no matter how many records she breaks, she still needs their approval to really belong. And now, with this jersey number controversy, they're making their move again. They're testing her, seeing how much she'll take before she breaks. They're betting that she wants to wear that USA jersey more than she wants to protect the identity that has made her untouchable. But here's what they don't understand. They're not just fighting with one player. They're fighting with every single person who has ever felt invisible, undervalued, or disposable. They're fighting with every immigrant family that has sacrificed everything for their children to have a chance at the American dream. They're fighting with every young woman who has been told to know her place. Caitlyn Clark has become something far more powerful than just a basketball player. She has become a symbol of possibility for millions of people who never thought they'd see themselves represented at this level of success. Her number 22 doesn't just represent her jersey. It represents the idea that your dreams matter, that your identity has value, that you can be authentically yourself while achieving greatness. And now they're asking her to abandon all of that, to walk away from the very thing that has made her special, that has connected her to millions of people, that has changed the entire landscape of women's sports. They're about to learn that they've picked the wrong fight with the wrong person at the wrong time. Because what happens next could fundamentally change everything we thought we knew about power dynamics in professional sports. And the stakes have never been higher. To understand how we reached this explosive confrontation, you need to meet the real villains in this story. This isn't about one bad decision or a simple misunderstanding. This is about a broken system run by people who have lost touch with reality, who think they can still treat athletes like disposable commodities in an era when players understand their worth better than ever. The villains in this story are the senior leadership at USA Basketball, a group of people who have spent years living in an ivory tower, making decisions about the sport's future while remaining completely disconnected from the sport's actual cultural power. They represent everything wrong with institutional sports: the arrogance, the outdated thinking, the fundamental inability to recognize that the game has passed them by.
At the center of this crisis stands Sue Bird, caught in an impossible position between loyalty to an organization she's devoted her life to and the harsh reality of basketball in 2025. Bird, one of the greatest players in basketball history, finds herself defending decisions she knows are fundamentally wrong. She has spent the last decade transitioning from player to executive, believing she could help modernize USA basketball from within. Instead, she has become trapped in a power structure that refuses to adapt to modern realities. Bird's colleagues on the senior leadership team have backgrounds that are classic examples of institutional capture. They rose through the ranks not because they understood basketball culture or athlete empowerment, but because they were good at following protocols and maintaining the status quo. They are administrators first, basketball people second, and completely disconnected from what players actually want and deserve. The pattern of disrespect toward Caitlyn Clark didn't start with this jersey number controversy. It has been building for over a year, as these executives watched her transform women's basketball from a niche sport into mainstream cultural phenomenon. Instead of celebrating this revolution, they saw it as a threat to their control. They watched her shatter attendance records, break television ratings, and bring in demographics they never thought possible, and their response was to try to put her in her place. The Olympic roster snub was the first major red flag. When Clark was left off the team despite being arguably the most recognizable and marketable athlete in women's basketball, the official explanation was that they needed veterans with international experience. But anyone with half a brain could see the real reason. The old guard was threatened by someone who had become bigger than their system. That decision backfired spectacularly, as USA Basketball found themselves fielding questions about why they excluded the player who had single-handedly saved their product from irrelevance. The backlash was swift and brutal, with fans, media, and even other players questioning the logic behind their choice. But instead of learning from their mistake, USA Basketball doubled down. The organization developed what can only be described as a Caitlyn Clark problem. They couldn't figure out how to handle someone who had transcended their ability to control her. She wasn't playing by their rules, wasn't showing the proper deference to institutional authority, wasn't accepting the role of grateful beneficiary of their generosity. So they did what all threatened institutions do. They tried to reassert control through arbitrary power displays. The jersey number mandate wasn't about logistics or tradition. It was about proving they still had authority, that no matter how popular Clark became, she still needed to submit to their will. What they fundamentally misunderstood was the power dynamics of modern sports. In an era when athletes can build their own brands, control their narratives, and reach audiences directly through social media, traditional institutional power has been severely weakened. Players like Clark don't need USA Basketball's approval to be successful. They bring value to USA Basketball, not the other way around. But USA Basketball's leadership operates as if it's still 1995, when athletes were grateful for any opportunity and institutions held all the cards. They crafted policies and protocols without considering how they would be perceived by a public that had watched Clark transform their sport. They made decisions based on bureaucratic convenience rather than cultural understanding. The internal meetings about Clark's jersey number were described by sources as exercises in institutional arrogance. Executives dismissed the idea that number 22 had any cultural significance beyond being just a number. They couldn't comprehend why anyone would make such a big deal about something so administrative. Their inability to understand the emotional and cultural weight of identity markers revealed their complete disconnection from the athletes they claimed to serve. Most damaging of all, they never considered the possibility that Clark might say no. They assumed she would accept their terms because that's what athletes were supposed to do. They never planned for a player who understood her worth and refused to compromise her dignity for their convenience. As the crisis unfolded, their true nature was revealed in the most damaging way possible. Instead of acknowledging their mistake and working to resolve it, they doubled down on their position. They issued statements about organizational consistency and team uniformity, while demonstrating neither consistency nor understanding of what makes teams truly unified. The most telling moment came when sources revealed that several executives were more concerned about the precedent Clark's resistance might set than about the specific issue at hand. They were willing to sacrifice their relationship with the most powerful player in their sport rather than admit they had made an error in judgment. This is what happens when institutions become more invested in maintaining their authority than in serving the people who make them relevant. USA Basketball's leadership proved they would rather be right than be respected, rather than controlled and serve. But they picked the wrong opponent at the wrong time. To understand why this moment matters so deeply, you need to understand who Caitlyn Clark really is and what she represents. This isn't just about another athlete making a stand. This is about the most authentic voice in basketball standing up to institutional power. And it all goes back to where she came from and what she's always fought for. Caitlyn Clark grew up in West Des Moines, Iowa, the daughter of immigrants who taught her that your identity is your strength, not your weakness. Her parents didn't just give her a last name. They gave her values that have guided her through every major decision of her career. They taught her that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. They showed her that compromise your principles once, and you'll compromise them again. When she chose number 22 on her 5th birthday, it wasn't random. January 22nd became a number that would define her entire journey because it represented the moment when basketball chose her, and she chose basketball back. That number has grown alongside her from backyard courts to packed arenas, from high school gyms to the biggest stages in sports history. It's not just digits on fabric. It's a promise she made to herself about never forgetting where she came from. But what makes Clark's story so powerful is that she never let success change who she was at her core, even as she shattered every scoring record in NCAA history, even as she became the most recognizable athlete in women's sports, even as she transformed from college phenom to global icon. She never forgot the values her family instilled in her. Her college career at Iowa wasn't just about breaking records. It was about proving that you could be authentically yourself while achieving greatness. She played with a joy and authenticity that was infectious, making three-pointers from distances that defied physics while never losing the sparkle in her eyes that reminded everyone why they fell in love with basketball in the first place. When the WNBA draft arrived, Clark had already become something unprecedented, a player whose impact transcended sport. She had filled arenas with fans who had never watched women's basketball before. She made the Iowa Hawkeyes the most watched college basketball team in America, period. She had become a cultural phenomenon that transcended demographics, bringing in audiences that no one thought were possible for women's sports. But here's what makes her response to USA basketball so predictable in hindsight. This isn't the first time she stood up for her principles when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Remember the Olympic snub? When she was left off the roster despite being the most marketable player in women's basketball history, she could have complained publicly, could have created drama, could have used her platform to attack USA basketball. Instead, she handled it with the dignity that has become her trademark. She didn't burn bridges. She walked away from a system that couldn't appreciate what they had. That decision taught us something crucial about Clark's character. She doesn't fight for attention or to create controversy. She fights when principles are at stake, when dignity is being compromised, when someone is asking her to abandon the very things that make her special. Her journey to becoming the face of women's basketball has been marked by moments where she chose authenticity over convenience. She could have changed her playing style to fit traditional expectations. She could have toned down her personality to appeal to corporate sponsors. She could have accepted the role of grateful beneficiary rather than the architect of her own success. Instead, she doubled down on everything that made her unique. She shot from distances that coaching manuals said were impossible. She celebrated her joy in ways that sometimes made traditionalists uncomfortable. She spoke her mind about issues that affected women's basketball, even when it wasn't politically convenient. This is why the jersey number controversy was always going to end the way it did. Clark has spent her entire career building something with number 22. That number represents her journey from overlooked high school player to global icon. It represents the dreams of every young girl who sees herself in her story. It represents the idea that you can be authentically yourself while achieving greatness. To ask her to abandon that identity for USA basketball's convenience is to fundamentally misunderstand who she is and what she represents. It's like asking Nike to give up the swoosh, or Apple to give up the bitten apple logo. Number 22 isn't just Clark's jersey number. It's her brand, her identity, her connection to the millions of people who have built their own dreams around her example. The beauty of Clark's story is that it validates everything America claims to believe about itself. She represents the immigrant dream. Come to this country, work hard, stay true to your values, and you can achieve anything. She represents the power of authenticity in a world that often rewards conformity. She represents the idea that success doesn't require you to abandon who you are. Her connection to fans goes beyond basketball. When people see Clark play, they see someone who never forgot her roots, who never compromised her values for success, who represents the possibility of being your authentic self while reaching the highest levels of achievement. This is why her stand against USA basketball resonates so deeply. It's not just about a jersey number. It's about the principle that your identity matters, that your values are worth protecting, that true champions never abandon the things that make them special. Clark has always understood something that the old guard at USA basketball never grasped. She doesn't need their approval to be great. Her worth isn't determined by any organization's recognition. Her value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it. And now, as we approach the moment of truth, that understanding is about to be tested in the most public way possible. But those who know Clark's story know exactly how this is going to end. The gymnasium had transformed from a place of athletic excellence into something resembling a gladiatorial arena, and Sue Bird could feel the momentum slipping away from her. What had started as a confident dismissal of Caitlyn Clark's concerns had somehow evolved into something far more dangerous, a public reckoning that she wasn't prepared for. You want to talk about disrespect? Sue's voice cracked slightly as she leaned forward, her former composure cracking like ice in spring thaw. You think wearing that number makes you entitled to special treatment? To rewrite decades of tradition? The words tumbled out faster now, each one less measured than the last. Some people earn their place in this league through years of dedication, through building something meaningful, not through social media hype and celebrity worship. Clark remained seated, her expression betraying nothing. She watched Sue's increasing agitation with the calm intensity of someone who had faced far worse obstacles and emerged stronger. When Clark finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had been tested and had not broken. Tradition built on exclusion isn't tradition worth preserving, Clark said, her words landing precisely where they needed to. It's an obstacle course, and I spent my entire career learning how to jump over those barriers. The simplicity of her statement hung in the air like a challenge that Sue couldn't quite grasp. But Sue was beyond rational discourse now. Months of resentment, of watching Clark receive attention that Sue felt she had earned through years of service to the game, had reached a boiling point. Obstacle course? She laughed, but it wasn't the warm, inclusive laughter that had made her beloved across the league. This was sharp, bitter. You want to talk about obstacles? I've been building bridges in this league when you were still in high school. I've been the bridge between generations, between players and management, between what this game was and what it's becoming. You didn't build anything. You just showed up and expected everyone to bow down. The crowd had grown uncomfortable now, shifting in their seats as they witnessed what appeared to be the unraveling of one of women's basketball's most respected figures. Some were recording on their phones, knowing they were witnessing something that would define how this generation remembered Sue Bird's legacy. Clark's response came with devastating simplicity. I never asked anyone to bow down. I asked them to see me. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle, to see me as I am, not as they needed me to be to make their narrative work. The slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth wasn't mocking. It was understanding. That's the difference between us. You spend your career trying to fit people into boxes. I spend mine trying to break out of them. Sue's face flushed, her carefully constructed image of gracious leadership beginning to crumble under the weight of her own words. She had entered this confrontation confident in her moral authority, certain that her years of service and cultural impact would validate her position. Instead, she found herself portrayed as exactly what she had spent years avoiding becoming, a gatekeeper who had forgotten that the game belonged to everyone who loved it, not just to those who had controlled its narrative. The room had gone completely silent now. The only sound a squeak of sneakers on polished floors and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. In that silence, it became clear to everyone present that what they were witnessing was more than a disagreement about jersey numbers or team dynamics. It was a fundamental shift in power, a generational changing of the guard that was happening in real time, and Sue Bird was the one being left behind. And the most devastating realization of all was that she was doing it to herself. As the tension reached its breaking point with Sue's credibility hanging by a thread and Clark's moral authority intact, the question that hung in the air was simple and terrifying. What would happen when someone like Sue Bird, used to being respected, used to having the last word, found herself completely unprepared for what came next? The silence stretched on like a held breath, and in that moment, Caitlyn Clark realized she had been waiting for this opportunity her entire life. Not the confrontation, not the conflict, but the chance to speak truth to power in a room full of people who desperately needed to hear it. Clark stood slowly, her movements deliberate and calm, drawing every eye in the gymnasium. She didn't raise her voice or gesture dramatically. Instead, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every word she was about to say. Sue, can I tell you something? Clark's voice carried easily through the space, clear and measured. I know you think this is about me, about my number, my attention, my story. She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room, making contact with faces that had been watching her every move since she entered the league. But this has never been about me at all. Sue shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her earlier confidence now replaced by something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. The crowd leaned forward unconsciously, sensing that the real battle was about to begin. You see, when I was 8 years old, my dad had to choose between buying me basketball shoes or paying the electricity bill. Clark's voice never wavered, never broke. Not because we were irresponsible, because my parents had sacrificed everything to give me a chance to be here. And there were hundreds of other little girls just like me, watching and dreaming and hoping that someday someone would see them too. The room had gone completely still now, the weight of Clark's words settling over everyone like a blanket. But here's what you might not understand about people like me, Sue. We don't play this game for the spotlight or the recognition, or even for the money. Clark took a step closer, her gaze never leaving Sue's face. We play because we know what it feels like to be invisible. And we spent our entire lives learning how to be visible for everyone who came before us who couldn't be. Sue opened her mouth to respond, but Clark continued, her words flowing like water finding its level. When you say I showed up and expected people to bow down, that's not what I did. What I did was show up and refuse to bow down to anyone who tried to tell me I didn't belong, who tried to tell me I had to be smaller or quieter or more acceptable to fit into their vision of what this league should be. Clark's voice was steady, but underneath it was a steel that made the truth of her words undeniable. I didn't ask for special treatment, Sue. I asked for equal treatment. The kind of treatment that you got automatically because you looked like the people who built this league in the first place. The room was so quiet now that the sound of Clark's breathing seemed loud. She had found her rhythm, the cadence of someone who had spent years practicing these words, not as an attack, but as an explanation. And yes, I wore number 22, but not because I wanted to follow in someone's footsteps. I wore it because I wanted to stand on someone's shoulders. Because every time someone tries to tell you that success is about knowing your place, about staying in your lane, about accepting what you're given, I wanted to be the person who said no. I'm going to redefine what success looks like. I'm going to create space for people who don't fit the traditional mold. Sue's face had gone pale, and the confident posture she had maintained throughout the early part of this confrontation was beginning to crumble. She looked like someone who had spent years building a certain image of herself, and was now watching it dissolve in real time. You want to talk about what I didn't build? Park's voice took on a quality that was almost gentle now, which somehow made her words cut even deeper. I built the pathway that let every little girl watching this right now know that she could be more than what society told her to be. I built the bridge that connected the game I love to the audience it deserves. I built a foundation that says excellence doesn't have to come with permission slips or acceptance letters. The gymnasium had become a cathedral of attention, with every person present recognizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Clark had shifted seamlessly from defense to offense, from responding to defining, and Sue Bird was discovering what it felt like to be on the receiving end of moral authority instead of wielding it. And here's what you need to understand, Sue. I'm not trying to diminish your contribution to this game. What I'm trying to do is expand it, because the legacy you built isn't supposed to be a museum piece. It's supposed to be a launching pad. It's supposed to be the foundation that makes the next generation possible, not the ceiling that limits how high they can fly. Clark paused, letting her words resonate through the space, and in that pause, the entire room seemed to exhale. So when I ask for respect, Sue, it's not about me. It's about every little girl who ever got told she wasn't good enough, tall enough, fast enough, or connected enough to play this game. It's about every player who had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. It's about creating a league where talent is the only thing that matters, not who you know or what you look like, or how long you've been playing the game. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that silence, Sue Bird realized she had been hoisted by her own petard. She had entered this conversation believing she held all the power, that her years of service and cultural impact gave her the authority to define what respect looked like. Instead, she had provided Caitlyn Clark with the perfect platform to deliver a masterclass in moral leadership that made Sue's position look not just wrong, but small. As Clark finished speaking, the weight of what had just occurred settled over the room like a curtain falling on the final act of a play. Sue Bird sat in stunned silence, her carefully constructed arguments reduced to rubble, while Clark stood calmly in the wreckage of Sue's credibility, having delivered the most devastating takedown the league had seen in years without ever raising her voice or losing her composure. The question that hung in the air now was simple and devastating. How do you recover from being completely outmaneuvered by someone who refused to fight dirty, but won anyway? And in the stunned silence of that gymnasium, everyone knew that Sue Bird's next move would determine not just her own legacy, but whether she was capable of adapting to a world that had fundamentally changed beneath her feet. Within minutes of the confrontation ending, the gymnasium began to feel like the epicenter of a digital earthquake, whose tremors were already spreading across every social media platform in America. Cell phones buzzed constantly, notifications flooding in faster than anyone could process them, as the footage of what had just occurred made its way into the digital bloodstream of a nation hungry for exactly this kind of unfiltered authenticity. The first wave hit Twitter like a tsunami of hashtags and viral moments. Hashtag Clark vs. Bird began trending within the first hour, but that was just the beginning. Hashtag number 22 respect followed close behind, alongside hashtag real leadership and hashtag respect the journey. The posts weren't just coming from casual fans, they were flowing in from verified accounts, celebrities, and people who understood that they had just witnessed something historic. Megan Rapinoe was among the first to weigh in, her tweet simple, but devastating in its impact. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Caitlyn Clark just showed us all what real leadership looks like. The retweets and likes accumulated at warp speed. But more importantly, her endorsement sent a clear message to anyone who might still be questioning the dynamics of what they had witnessed. LeBron James, never one to shy away from important conversations, posted a video response that would later be viewed millions of times. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth. With dignity, he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had navigated his own journey through similar challenges. Caitlyn Clark didn't just defend herself. She defended every person who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere they earned the right to be. The ripple effects cascaded through sports culture with remarkable speed. NBA players began sharing their own experiences of feeling dismissed or undermined despite their achievements. Women's soccer stars spoke about the parallels between Clark's experience and their own battles for recognition and respect. Even some of Sue Bird's former teammates found themselves in the awkward position of having to acknowledge that their beloved leader had potentially crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. But it was the reaction from everyday people that truly captured the magnitude of what had occurred. Working mothers posted videos explaining to their daughters why Clark's words about visibility and belonging resonated so deeply. Immigrant families shared their own stories of building bridges in communities that had initially seemed closed to them. Young black women spoke about watching Clark's calm composure in the face of aggression and seeing a blueprint for how to handle similar situations in their own lives. The video clips themselves became cultural artifacts shared across every platform with the kind of exponential growth that only happens when content strikes a universal chord. Clark's words about her father choosing between basketball shoes and electricity bills went viral in edited clips, often paired with the imagery of her calm, measured delivery. The contrast between her composure and Sue Bird's increasingly agitated responses became a masterclass in different approaches to conflict that thousands of people studied and dissected. Comedians began crafting material about the encounter, but even their jokes seemed to carry an undertone of respect for Clark's performance. Under pressure, late-night talk show hosts found themselves in the unusual position of discussing not just the confrontation itself, but what it represented about changing power dynamics in sports and society. The conversation evolved far beyond basketball into broader questions about respect, representation, and what it means to be an ally versus an obstacle. The WNBA itself found itself in an unprecedented position. League officials, who had spent years carefully managing the league's image and relationships, now had to navigate a situation where their most recognizable figure had been publicly challenged and defeated by their newest star. League official social media accounts went quiet for several hours, clearly waiting to see which direction the wind was blowing before making any statements. Meanwhile, sports journalists who had covered women's basketball for decades found themselves struggling to contextualize what they had witnessed. The story wasn't just about a confrontation between two players. It was about generational change, about the difference between positional authority and moral authority, about what respect actually looked like when it was tested under pressure. By evening, major news outlets had picked up the story, but they struggled to capture the full significance of what had occurred. This wasn't just a sports story. It was a cultural moment that touched on questions of race, class, gender, and power that extended far beyond the basketball court. Cable news shows debated the implications, often missing the point entirely while trying to force the confrontation into familiar political frameworks. The most telling moment came when a group of young women, barely teenagers, posted a video of themselves reenacting Clark's calm delivery of her most powerful lines. They weren't doing it mockingly or sarcastically. They were studying her words, her posture, her tone, as if she had just delivered a masterclass in how to handle being attacked while maintaining your dignity. As the digital storm continued to build throughout the day and into the night, one thing became increasingly clear. Caitlyn Clark had not just won a confrontation, she had redefined what victory looked like, and in doing so, she had accidentally started a conversation that would continue long after the hashtag stopped trending and the news cycles moved on to the next story. The question now wasn't whether Sue Bird could recover from this public defeat. It was whether the culture that had enabled her behavior could survive the spotlight that Clark had just shone on it. As the digital storm continued to rage across social media platforms and news outlets struggled to capture the full significance of what had transpired, Caitlyn Clark found herself in the surreal position of having to navigate not just the aftermath of her confrontation with Sue Bird, but the weight of becoming something she had never intended to be. A symbol of generational change that extended far beyond basketball. 3 days after the incident, Clark sat in her apartment, phone buzzing constantly with interview requests, support messages, and media appearances that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. She had expected some reaction, perhaps even significant discussion about the issues they had raised. What she hadn't expected was to find herself at the center of a movement that seemed to coalesce around her words and demeanor in ways that felt both inspiring and overwhelming. The calls from her parents had been the most grounding. Her father's voice had carried a mixture of pride and concern as he spoke about the messages they were receiving from families across the country. "Baby," he had said quietly, "I think you might not realize what you started." It wasn't just about the confrontation itself. It was about the thousands of people who saw in her calm resolve and measured words a blueprint for how to handle being dismissed or diminished despite their achievements. Clark's first instinct was to downplay her role, to redirect attention away from herself and back to the broader issues they had discussed. But as she watched the conversations unfold across social media and traditional media, she began to understand that her response to Sue Bird's attack had struck a chord that went far deeper than she had initially realized. People weren't just reacting to what she had said. They were responding to how she had said it, to the dignity she had maintained under pressure, to the way she had transformed a personal attack into a teaching moment. The real revelation came when she received a call from a high school teacher in Detroit, who explained how her students had spent an entire class period discussing Clark's words about visibility and belonging. The teacher told her about immigrant students who had never felt represented in professional sports, about working-class families who saw their own struggles reflected in Clark's story about her father's choice between electricity and basketball shoes, about young women who were learning that strength didn't require volume, that authority didn't require aggression. That conversation changed everything for Clark. She began to understand that her response to Sue Bird had accidentally become a masterclass in how to handle adversity with grace, how to convert personal attacks into universal truths, how to maintain your dignity while defending your values. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about what it meant to be a leader in a culture that often rewarded the loudest voice rather than the wisest one. When Clark finally agreed to do a series of interviews to address the aftermath, she made a conscious decision to reframe the entire conversation. Rather than dwelling on Sue Bird's attack or defending her own position, she used each platform as an opportunity to discuss what the confrontation had revealed about respect, about belonging, about what it meant to be an ally versus an obstacle to progress. We live in a culture that often mistakes volume for authority and seniority for wisdom, Clark told a major sports network interviewer her words measured and thoughtful. But real leadership isn't about how loud you can be or how long you've been in a position of power. It's about how you use that power to lift others up, to create pathways rather than barriers, to ensure that the progress you helped achieve becomes the foundation for even greater achievements. The interviewer pressed her about Sue Bird specifically, hoping for sound bites that would reignite the controversy. Instead, Clark delivered what would become one of the most widely shared moments from the aftermath discussions. Sue Bird has done incredible things for women's basketball. Her legacy isn't diminished by this moment, it's complicated by it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Growth requires discomfort. Progress requires us to examine our own biases and assumptions about what respect looks like and who gets to define it. In that moment, Clark demonstrated something that would define her public presence going forward, the ability to convert conflict into conversation, to reframe attacks as opportunities for broader understanding, to maintain her principles while refusing to be drawn into personal warfare. She had transformed what could have been an ongoing feud into a teachable moment about dignity, grace, and what authentic leadership looked like in practice. The most powerful response came when Clark addressed the young women who had been inspired by her handling of the confrontation. In a social media post that would be shared hundreds of thousands of times, she wrote, "Every person watching this who felt invisible, who was told they don't belong somewhere they earn the right to be, who had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition, your stories matter, your struggles matter, your dreams matter, and the way you handle adversity defines not just who you are, but who you can become." As the conversations evolved and the immediate drama of the confrontation began to settle into deeper discussions about power, privilege, and progress in sports and society, one truth became increasingly clear. Caitlyn Clark had not just defended herself against an attack. She had redefined what victory looked like in an era when social media often rewarded the most aggressive response rather than the most thoughtful one. The lesson she had accidentally taught through her response to Sue Bird's attack was profound and simple. True strength lies not in the ability to destroy your opponent, but in the capacity to transform conflict into understanding, to maintain your dignity while defending your values, and to use your platform to create space for others rather than simply occupying space for yourself. And in a culture desperate for examples of how to handle being attacked while staying true to your principles, that lesson proved to be exactly what people have been waiting for. Shocking. Sue Bird's meltdown over number 22, Caitlyn Clark's reply, "Yendies everything," became more than just a headline. It became a defining moment that showed us what real courage looks like in an era when we need it most. What we witnessed wasn't just a confrontation between two basketball players. It was a masterclass in how to handle being attacked while maintaining your dignity, how to convert personal attacks into universal truth, and how to transform conflict into conversation. Clark didn't just defend herself. She redefined what victory means when your principles are tested under pressure. This is what leadership looks like in the modern age. Not volume, not aggression, not seniority, but the ability to maintain your values while lifting others up, not destroying your opponent, but creating pathways for those who come after you, not occupying space, but creating space for everyone who deserves to be seen. The conversation that began in that gymnasium has continued in living rooms, classrooms, and communities across America. Young women are learning that strength doesn't require volume. Working families are seeing their own struggles reflected in stories of sacrifice and determination. Immigrant communities are finding representation in sports and leadership that they never had before. This is the America we aspire to be, where talent is recognized regardless of background, where dignity triumphs over aggression, where respect is earned through character rather than just credentials. Caitlyn Clark didn't just walk away from disrespect that day. She walked toward a better future for everyone who refuses to be silenced or diminished. If this story inspired you, if you believe in a world where respect is mutual and opportunities are equal, then you're part of this movement too. Share this video. Start conversations in your own communities. Be the person who creates space for others rather than barriers for them. Subscribe to be part of a community that values dignity over drama, character over controversy, and progress over the status quo, because the real victory isn't in winning arguments, It's in changing hearts and building bridges. The future belongs to those who refuse to be silenced, who maintain their values under pressure, and who understand that true leadership is about lifting others up, not tearing them down. Caitlyn Clark showed us how it's done. Now it's our turn to follow her example. That's how you turn personal attacks into universal truths. That's how you transform disrespect into dignity. And that's how you become the leader this world desperately needs.